ashes of the Soviets. Mr. Khrushchev said he will bury you. I don't subscribe to this point of view. When I say to you, I hope the Russians love their children too.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was born out of the ashes of World War II and the growing Cold War between the US and the USSR. As each superpower tried to spread its ideology, they engaged in skirmishes and proxy wars, but never head-on. By 1949, the USSR had detonated its first nuclear bomb, ending the USA's monopoly on nuclear arms and causing a nuclear arms race. These two superpowers rallied their allies, with NATO being formed in 1949 by the USA and its Atlantic allies, and the Warsaw Pact being signed in 1955 by the USSR and its Eastern European allies in retaliation. 110 miles south of Florida, the island nation of Cuba became a focal point in the Cold War. Much of Cuba's fertile land was owned by American corporations. In 1952, the leader of Cuba was a corrupt dictator, Fulgencio Batista. Young lawyer Fidel Castro civilly petitioned to overthrow Batista, but was rejected by the corrupt Cuban courts. After failing to sway the tide peacefully, Fidel and his brother Raúl stockpiled weapons and from 1953 to 1959 led an armed revolution against Batista. The Castro brothers, along with Argentinian radical Che Guevara, whom the duo met in 1955, usurped Batista's tyrannical reign, despite interjections from the U.S. When Fidel and the revolutionists usurped Batista, they installed communism into the island, much to the delight of the Soviet Union and despair of the United States. The Cuban Revolution led to an embargo of Cuba by the U.S., which as of 2014 still stands. With a communist outpost just 110 miles south of Florida, the administrations of President Eisenhower and later Kennedy decided it was their responsibility to defend the U.S. from communism. With the links between Cuba and the Soviet Union showing more strongly, President Eisenhower gave the CIA $13.1 million to organize a coup of Castro. The CIA rounded up remnants of the administration that Castro had overthrown and other Cuban exiles. Following the election of President Kennedy in 1960, the OK was given by Kennedy to invade the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. In April 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles and 8 American bombers laid siege to Cuba. The invasion forces at first overwhelmed Cuba's militia, but eventually Fidel Castro personally took charge of the Cuban army and drove the invaders out of Cuba. 4 days after landing, the invaders surrendered. The failure of America's invasion strengthened Castro and caused him to openly support communism and the USSR. Meanwhile, across the globe in Europe, the USA had placed Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, aimed at Moscow. The Soviets were surrounded by American allies. Meanwhile, the US was far away from any strong Soviet ally. Fearing a first strike from America, Khrushchev put the responsibility on his shoulders and decided to seek help from his new ally, Cuba. Without the aid of Cuba, Russia could only hit America in Alaska, but by placing missiles in Cuba, they could hit most major cities. In early 1962, Soviet missile specialists covertly went to Havana and met with Fidel Castro. Castro, who fully expected another U.S. invasion, was delighted by the Soviet proposal. After getting the go-ahead from Castro, Khrushchev began covertly moving missiles into Cuba to keep utmost secrecy. The missiles were transported in civilian cargo vessels. In September of 1962, the U.S. government grew suspicious and ordered a military exercise in the Caribbean. On September 11th, the USSR issued a statement saying any attack on Cuba or a Soviet ship would mean war. Invasion plans for Cuba were being drawn up by the U.S., and spy planes flew continuously around the Caribbean. On October 14th, spy plane pictures had confirmed that the Soviets did indeed place missiles in Cuba. First thing the next morning, President Kennedy was informed. He convened a meeting of the National Security Council and 5 other key advisors in a group formerly XCOM. The U.S. had no plan because intelligence was convinced the USSR wouldn't have the audacity to place missiles in Cuba. The XCOM quickly thought up 6 solutions to solve the crisis. Do nothing, use diplomacy, send a warning, blockade Cuba, send an airstrike, or invade. The Joint Chiefs of Staff all agreed full-scale invasion was the only answer, but Kennedy was not convinced. Kennedy believed if the U.S. invaded Cuba, the USSR would have a direct path to conquer Berlin. Kennedy knew it was his responsibility to protect both America and their allies in Europe. On October 22nd, Kennedy settled on blockade and made the situation public. The natural response was panic and fear. During Kennedy's speech, 1 heavy cruiser and 1 destroyer headed out to Cuba. Khrushchev publicly sent out warnings of war to Kennedy, but privately the two held peaceful discussions. They both agreed that it was their responsibility to avoid a nuclear war and protect the rights of humanity. On October 24th, a crucial showdown at sea commenced between the U.S. blockade and Soviet warships bound for Cuba. Any attempt by Soviet ships to breach the U.S. blockade would likely have been met by a military exchange and very likely have escalated to a nuclear conflict. This incident may have been the closest the world has ever come to a nuclear war. Thankfully, the Soviet ships stopped short of the blockade and avoided a military conflict. By this time, the main battle plans of the U.S. consisted of their invasion of Cuba, and on the other side, Fidel Castro pressured Nikita Khrushchev into making a first strike on the U.S. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev resisted the pressure of their allies and made the responsible decision to protect the rights of their citizens. Despite the massive responsibilities placed on their shoulders, Kennedy and Khrushchev remained calm and engaged in diplomatic conversations. On October 26th, Khrushchev offered his first deal, offering to remove missiles from Cuba if Kennedy promised to never invade Cuba. The next day, Khrushchev offered the removal of missiles in Cuba in exchange for the U.S. removing missiles from Turkey and Italy. Kennedy officially agreed to the terms of the first deal, but privately agreed to withdraw missiles from Turkey. U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy personally delivered the message to the Soviet ambassador. On October 28th, the resolution was announced publicly by both the U.S. and the USSR. After 13 long and tense days, the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved. The Cuban Missile Crisis sobered both Kennedy and Khrushchev. The following year, a hotline was installed from Moscow to Washington in an attempt to defuse similar situations from happening again. Both leaders realized they had a responsibility to protect the rights and lives of their citizens from nuclear holocaust. Even though missiles were removed from Cuba and Turkey, the nuclear arms race and the Cold War were a long way from over. If Kennedy and Khrushchev had taken the rights of their peoples lightly, the Cuban Missile Crisis could have climaxed in perhaps the most impactful event in human history. Luckily, both Kennedy and Khrushchev kept their wits about them and did the responsible thing not to engage in a nuclear war, one which would have likely ravaged the entire world. The human race has the two of them to thank for protecting our rights to life.
Under pressure.